Well, thank you very much.
Yep, it's on.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I tend not to stand by the mic. As a teacher, it feels very strange to stand here and so if you can't hear me, just holler at me and I will speak up even louder, but hopefully everybody can hear me. My name is Leslie Heaphy. I'm a faculty member at Kent State University at Stark, which is in North Canton, Ohio. So a couple hours drive from here this morning. Thankfully, the snow came earlier this week. I was watching and I thought, but it was all good, bright and sunny. The only hassle I had, was it was very strange. The train coming up here stopped right in the middle of the tracks. And I thought, oh dear, I hope that's not a long term because I don't know where I am. Thankfully, it was only 10 minutes. I have no idea why it stopped in the middle of the tracks, but that's why I always tell your students, leave early when you're doing something, right, just in case. So I've been teaching history at Kent State for 25 years now. And so my background and research area is in sports history. That's what I do. And I have written and edited currently 6 books and I don't know how many articles, book chapters, et cetera, on women's baseball and Negro leagues. So that's my prime area of expertise, but I teach a sports history class on a regular basis on our campus, and so getting a chance to talk about some of those individuals that we know, and I assume everybody recognizes this individual.
Jackie Robinson.
Okay, how about
Althea Gibson, Arthur Adams.
Okay, so recognizing that there are some that are immediately recognizable, but certainly many that came before, and that's really part of what I want to look at is some of those that we recognize, and probably more likely many that we do not, simply because of the nature of the history of this country and the way things have been and were and still are to a certain degree. If we think not, then we are fooling ourselves. And so when we look at this particular issue, we tend to look at it obviously during Black History Month, but as I told my students the other day, I was giving a presentation on the Harlem Renaissance and said we should be doing all of this all the time and not just at one point in time. But that being said, the story usually starts for most people. They recognize Jackie Robinson, so I thought I'd start here as well and just remind everybody that when Jackie was signed in 1945 by the Brooklyn Dodgers, when Branch Rickey made that decision, Jackie Robinson didn't spring out of nowhere, right? As if there was nobody before him, and there was nobody, and yet that's sort of how it is often portrayed, and certainly from the standpoint of Major League Baseball, that was sort of their attitude, that there had just not been Black players before that, African American players who were capable of playing at the Major League level, which was not true, obviously. And so Jackie Robinson's opportunity when it came for him then to play in 1947, he debuted in April of 1947, and then went on to have a stellar career, though a shorter one because he came in, he was already well into his late 20s by the time he had the opportunity. That's going to be typical for many of those athletes who got the chance to play in the 40s and 50s, because that's when the vast majority of our professional sports are going to finally move towards either integration, or in some cases I would argue the more proper word, even in the case of Jackie Robinson, as you'll see a little bit later, is actually reintegration. Because at one time, baseball was integrated, did have black and white players playing together, as did football. Right? Basketball was the only one that was a true integration because it comes along a little bit later, and so its start comes in the era of Jim Crow. Right, and so Robinson's debut certainly changed things, and for most it was the beginning of what they thought was going to be a positive change, right? But the doors don't swing open immediately, right? And so it will take from 1947 until 1959 for every major league team to have one African American player, and you can probably guess what city was likely to have the last one. They've long had the whitest sports teams you could possibly look at, and that would be the city of Boston. Boston was known for that. When you think about, for example, the Boston Celtics, for the longest time, were the whitest basketball team out there, right? And so Pumpsie Green became the last individual in 1959. At that point, that meant, and this is all it meant, every team had at least one black player on it. Some had, the Pittsburgh Pirates were the first to have an entire outfield that was African American. So it was a slow start after Robinson. Robinson, of course, his story, and this is he with his wife and his son Jackie Jr. in various ball games. This one was when he was traded from the Dodgers to the Giants, and that's when he decided to retire. But Robinson's story was true of many. Grew up in the South, state of Georgia. His mom moved him out to California. He grew up in a different setting there, which allowed him to go to college. He entered the Army. His brother, of course, was also an athlete and was an Olympic athlete. People tend to forget about Mac, and they only hear about Jackie. But his brother was, in some ways, probably just as good an athlete. What's the amazing thing about Robinson, and I think this is true, and it tells you a lot about American society at the time, baseball was actually his worst sport. He was a much better football player, and he was an outstanding track athlete like his brother, and yet baseball is the one he made his mark in because he had the opportunity, but baseball was his worst sport. Okay, and so it's just something to keep in mind, and tells you where the opportunities were in terms of that. And that's because baseball was much more popular, and it was the most popular sport at the time. And so the opportunities there to have that chance came in baseball and not elsewhere. Football was not the popular sport it is today, right? And neither was basketball. And basketball's opportunities weren't there yet. And so Robinson began a path that changed sports for many, but it was not his best. And so thought I'd mention that as well. Chose a variety of athletes to introduce you to in a variety of different sports to sort of give you a little bit of background. And boxing has certainly been an important sport in American history for a variety of reasons. And this is one of our earliest both national, but more importantly, international champions. This is Tommy Milano, who began life, as you can imagine from his time frame in the 18 teens, as a slave, but was given his freedom through his prowess in the boxing ring, though much of that prowess did not come here in the United States. Milano had the opportunity to leave the United States, and he went to Ireland and England. And it is there that he fought Tommy Cribbs, the British champion, because the Brits were the leaders in boxing. They came up with all of the gentleman's rules and then the real rules. And so Milano and Cribbs fought for an international title, which he won, and then a number of other fights. And he pretty much remained outside of the United States. He did not come back, simply because there were no opportunities for him here. And he stayed in England, and he fought in both England and Ireland, but he was recognized as a citizen of and representing the United States, which is kind of unusual. And so a lot of, when we think about American sporting heroes, this is a time period where we can start. He's one of the earliest, certainly to win any kind of recognition and title. And boxing will continue to be an area where African Americans are going to make their mark. As we move forward, there are many of them in the second half of the 19th century, and then certainly, as we'll talk about a couple of them in the 20th century, who really set the pattern. But Milano kind of gets things started for everybody. And so we don't have a good record of his entire career in terms of, because these things weren't necessarily reported the same way they are today, or they were even later on. But we do know, and the estimate at the time, one of the big things for him was he won about $3,000 for his initial win over Tommy Cribbs. Think about that back in 1810. That is a great deal of money that would change his opportunities, and it certainly did. But he didn't come back here to the United States. And so this began America's very, challenging idea of thinking about how to embrace a person who is a champion when it's somebody that they don't recognize, right? And so the same thing's going to happen with Jack Johnson. You could argue the same thing's going to happen with Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, right? And all of the, and that sort of takes your boxing right up into the 1970s and 1980s, and it starts here with Tommy Milano. Okay, where African Americans really made their mark in the 19th century is as jockeys, because this was the premier sport of the second half of the 19th century, and this is one of the more famous of the jockeys. This is Jimmy Wingfield. He won the Kentucky Derby in both 1901 and 1902. The dominance of African American jockeys in horse racing from the start of the Kentucky Derby until into the early 1900s was unprecedented. And this was the primary sport. And if you think about America in the 19th century, second half, it makes sense, right? Because most of them, African Americans, after the Civil War, even though we have the Emancipation Proclamation, right? We have Reconstruction. Many stayed in the South and continued to work on the plantations that they had previously been enslaved on. And so working on the plantations, natural connection to, they didn't own the horses, right? White owners, black jockeys, who's making the money? Right? And who owns the horses? But it is the jockeys. And when you read about horse racing in the 19th century, it's not like what you see today at all. It was a very brutal, very scary sport, and particularly for African Americans. For the few white riders who tended to participate, they would go out of their way often to try to unseat the black jockeys, to ensure that their horses were run off the, and so it's amazing in some ways that many of them stuck with it and earned a great deal of respect, titles for themselves, not surprisingly, not a great deal of money. The money tended, as I say, to go to the plantation owners and the owners of the horses. But Jimmy Wingfield is certainly one example of that. But to give you an idea, so the Kentucky Derby started in 1875. In the first Kentucky Derby, 15 jockeys, 13 of them were African American, just to give, so that's the kind of dominance that was there. What's interesting today is if you look at horse racing, and I don't know if anybody follows horse racing today at all, there are none. And so from the early 1900s, you won't see another black jockey with any participating in any of the big races again until the 1960s. There's a complete shift as the country shifts from a more rural into a more urban setting after 1900. So this is a rather unusual circumstance. 15 of the first 28 derbies are won by African Americans. And so that's just slightly over 50% of them are won. The youngest won at 15 years of age. He was 15, one of the jockeys who won. Isaac Murphy is probably the most well-known of all of the early jockeys. He won the Kentucky Derby 3 times, first of anybody to do that, didn't matter who they were. He won in 1884, 1890, and 1891. And there's been a couple of books written about Murphy and his background and his participation simply because he was the first to have that kind of a career. He went on, continued to race into the early 1900s, and so had a fairly lengthy career as a jockey. Okay. Joe Drape, who has written a great deal, he said, "It became too dangerous to put black riders on horses. An influx of Irish immigrants were now slugging it out on the track, riding black jockeys into railings and making them fall." That's what began to make the change. In the latter part of the 19th century, as we industrialized, immigrants coming in from different parts of the world, and things began to change. And so Irish immigrants in particular started to take over some of these sporting areas. And so they found this as a way that they could integrate themselves into American society, because we didn't treat Irish immigrants very well either. And so this was a way for them to find a place, and they're going to use the sporting world for the most part, which meant you're going to push other people out. And so and so that's one of the reasons why we see the change. The other, as I say, is because American society as a whole changes. Okay, so this is an unusual area where we see lots of participation by African Americans. Okay, this is another one of the young men who was a jockey, William Walker. He won in 1877, and so examples. So just a few of those that you never hear about, and most people. Had anybody heard of Isaac Murphy before? That's usually the only one if somebody has heard of it. Jimmy Wingfield, there's a new book that just came out on him a couple years ago, so he's the only other one that really gets any attention so far. Because it's hard to track down these records, as you can imagine. Not a lot of black newspapers in the 19th century till the latter part of the 19th century. White newspapers not writing about most of these kinds of things, and so hard to track down who these stories are and know too much about them. Okay, that's Isaac Murphy. Just so you can see who he was. And so this was the group who dominated the world of jockeys and horse racing. Horse racing, not surprisingly, might surprise you as being sort of one of the biggest sports in the late 90s, but it was America's first actual professional modern sport, dating all the way back to the early 1800s, and actually into the 1700s. Because horses were readily available, you had lots of land, and so horse racing is actually considered America's first modern sport. And so it's interesting that they have that opportunity. Okay? Cycling is also another one from the 19th century, and this is Marshal Major Taylor, more commonly known simply as Major. His first name was actually Marshal. This is him racing in a track that was later rebuilt and named for him in Indianapolis, which is where he comes from. He got his nickname Major because when he was a youngster, he worked for a local business and they used him to sort of advertise. So he wore a military uniform and he would do tricks on his bicycle out in front of the store, and so he earned the nickname Major, even though he had no military background at all. And he went on to become a professional racer, as you can see there, 1896. He started 1896, within 2 years, 7 world records, won in that first 2 years 70% of the races he entered. And that was all here in the United States. He went on then to race internationally, mostly in France, big racing world in France. And so he went on to have both national and international fame, much more famous and much more well treated overseas than he was here in the United States. Unfortunately for him here in the United States, again, most of the money that he made often was withheld from him, not given to him, taken by whoever had sponsored him into the race, things like that. So money was hard to come by, but bicycle racing was huge. And as I say, recognition for him came fairly recently when they rebuilt the racetrack in Indianapolis and named it the Major Taylor Racing Track. So there's a number of books written about him, so if you are interested, there's even a couple children's books on which is kind of unusual. You don't see too many of those on Major Taylor. Cycling was huge in the late 19th century, both just as a general mode of transport and then obviously as a more sporting idea. And there were all kinds of people participating, and Taylor certainly was the most famous. But I also thought I'd introduce you to a woman who was kind of an interesting young lady. This is Kitty Knox. And she belonged to Bicycle Club, the Riverside Bicycle Club in Boston, which was an all-black bicycling club in Boston, right before the turn of the century in the 1890s. And while she didn't necessarily get to race as Major Taylor did, her participation in a cycling club put her out there on a regular basis. And what is fascinating about her is she was a card-carrying member of the League of American Wheelmen, which was the National Association for Bicyclists in the 1890s. And so you had to apply, and there were very few women. And in fact, she showed up at a race in 1896, and they tried to send her away. And they said she needed to leave, she had no business being there. And she pulled out her card and said, "But I'm a member." And they said, "You can't be." And it wasn't because she was black, first and foremost. In this case, it was because you're a woman. And then it was like, oh, and wait, you're black as well. But it was, you're a woman. And so she created a huge scandal when she walked in right off the start because of her attire, as you can imagine. If you are like me and you like to wear shorts and pants today, we can thank our bicycling female friends of the 1890s, because that's where the biggest change in female attire came from. The bloomers were from the 1840s, but they didn't catch on until the 1880s and 1890s because of bicycles, because you couldn't ride a bicycle properly wearing the big heavy skirts and things, so we can thank them. And so Kitty Knox certainly was part of that group. There are all kinds of stories in the newspapers in Boston about her, people complaining mostly about seeing her out on the streets, and they were complaining about her attire, that this was an improper thing for a woman to be doing. The League of American Wheelmen got a lot of flack because they let her enter. The League of American Wheelmen, just to give you an idea, had put out a sort of like a how-to kind of directional aimed at men. And you'll appreciate sort of the attitude when I tell you two things that were in there. Men were told that they could not spit when they were out riding their bikes anymore, right? Because it would fly back and now it would hit the women who might be on the bicycles behind them, and that was ungentlemanly behavior. And the other was they weren't allowed to ride past a wobbly. And they identified then a wobbly specifically as a woman on a bike who might get scared and you'd knock her off because she would wobble as you went past her and she would fall. So that sort of gives you a sense of the attitude of the time period. So Kitty Knox was kind of an unusual on many levels when she entered the cycling world. Another area that was a little different in the 19th century, because we didn't have the professional sports of today, was pedestrianism. Walking races with huge pots of money attached to them. And so this is Frank Hart, who in 1880 participated in a race. And the race was set up as typical, where they were called free races or free walks. And I find it amazing that anybody would go to sit and watch, but they did, because it was set up over a certain number of days, and your sole goal was to walk the track as many times as you possibly could before the days were up, taking breaks as you needed to, etc. And so he set a record of 565 miles he walked in 6 days. To win a purse that was the equivalent of just under $10,000 in 1880, which today would translate into nearly $700,000 in today's money, just to give you a sense of, and so this is Frank Hart.
How much money, excuse me, how much money do you say you won?
About just under $10,000.
But it amounted to $700,000 now.
Approximately, yeah. That'd be, and there he is with this is a drawing in the newspaper. He is leading the way in front of a white walker, and there were 13 walkers who finished that particular, but this was a very common thing to have people come out and watch. I don't know if I would have stayed for 6 days to watch people walking round and round, but they did, and Frank Hart certainly was the most well-known African-American participant, though his name was often left out of accounts in the papers, and they would just mention the African-American gentleman or the black gentleman without his name in some of the stories, which unfortunately also complicates trying to go back and put together the histories of some of these individuals. For women, it's even more difficult because they tended to, particularly for African-American women, to only put their first names in the paper. So they'd talk about Miss Sue and and you're like, that isn't very helpful. We have no idea who these people are, right? And so difficult sometimes to put their stories together, but here they are. So returning back to the baseball world to show you that Jackie Robinson certainly was not unique, and he didn't spring out of nowhere. This is a picture, a team from the 1880s with, as you can see, 2 African-American players on this particular team. They are brothers. This is Moses, and this is him over here. That's Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother, Wendell Walker. Moses was a catcher, and Wendell was an outfielder. He only played in a few games, and so it appears that probably likely that he was simply there to provide someone for his brother to travel with and for the team, because they couldn't travel together, they couldn't stay with the team, etc. Moses was the catcher, and just to give you an idea, in one of his best seasons in 1884, he hit .256 in just under 60 games. And that may not sound if you're a bit, but you have to remember that this is in the 1880s. He is a black catcher catching pitchers who are all white, right? And in the 1880s, of course, you didn't catch with a glove, because gloves were not yet a part of the, so you can imagine the circumstances. So when you see close-up pictures of him, it's apparent, it becomes readily apparent, and this was not unusual for necessarily any catcher, but it was clear he'd probably broken every single one of his fingers on his hands. Big scars where his fingers had been split. It would be very difficult for him, more so than any other catcher, when you've got pitchers who don't want him there, and they can throw the ball anywhere they want, and they don't really care. Walker is unique because he and his brother Welde in 1884 actually played here in Ohio for the Toledo White Stockings, who were a major league team at the time.
How do you spell that?
His name?
Yeah.
W-E-L-D-A-Y.
Okay.
You'll sometimes see it spelled just W-E-L-D-Y, but it actually should be A-Y. Okay? But they played for Toledo. And Toledo, for 1 year, was part of the American Association. This was before there was an American League and the only one that existed was the National League. So the American Association was considered a major league. So when people tell you that Jackie Robinson is the first to play in the major leagues, that's actually not true. He is the first in the 20th century. Moses and his brother Welde played, but there's another that we found as well. So there were more. Moses Fleetwood Walker is generally considered to be there, he and his brother, the last, because shortly after this and through this time period was the beginning of a creation of what became known as just the gentleman's agreement. That's what Jackie Robinson broke. There was never anything written down. It was just simply understood, hence a gentleman's agreement, that nobody was going to sign any African-American player. And so the few attempts that were made to do that, there's an attempt in the early 20th century when John Montgomery Ward decides to try to sign a player. His name was Charlie Grant, but he changed his name, so they called him Chief Tokahama, so they would think he was Indian. Unfortunately for him, it became readily apparent that he was not Chief Tokahama when the group that showed up to watch him play made it very apparent, and he never got a chance to play. So Walker and his brother, Walker went on, he's interesting, he attended Oberlin College, and so again, contrary to a lot, you're going to see that many of our folks who have these opportunities also had educational opportunities, but he attended both Oberlin and the University of Michigan. He went on to law school there, and then after his baseball career ended, he went back down to, and I hear it all the time differently from people, but a town in southern Ohio, Gallipolis or depending on, I've been down, even when I was there, I gave a presentation down there. The people in the audience couldn't agree what they called their own town. So I'm just like, you all know which, but that's where he had ended up. His father was from there, and he went back to take over his father's barbershop, and so that's kind of where he ended up. He also wrote a book, which is kind of interesting, and you can find it. It's very unusual at this time. It's called Our Home Colony. And basically, what Walker was arguing was in favor of the Back to Africa movement. He basically said, it's never going to change here in the United States. We're never going to get an opportunity, so we just ought to go back to our home, even though they'd never been there, right? And so it's rather sad commentary on what he saw at the time. He didn't think things would ever change, so there was no point in staying. So he's got an interesting career. If you go up to Toledo, there's a marker outside the stadium there for him, recognizing him as the first to play in the Negro Leagues, or in major leagues. We've since discovered another player, and he is in this particular picture. His name, ironically, is William White, but in June 21st of 1879, so he preceded Walker by 5 years. He played in one game. He scored 1 run, stole 2 bases, made no errors in the field, and his team won. They beat, this is the Providence Grays, Providence team that he's playing for. And you'll see why it was so hard to discover him, because when you look at this picture, can anybody tell me who he is?
He's sitting behind the man with the dark jacket on.
So here, yes, that would be correct. For most people, they're not entirely sure because sometimes this gentleman, but that is William White. Okay? And William White is indicative of another aspect of American society, and William White passed for white. And so discovering him has been difficult. His father was white, his mother was African American. He listed himself on the census as white.
I was just thinking, especially since it's like History Month.
Sure, absolutely.
Now, I've never heard of this man, never known him, never seen him, but most black people tend to recognize other people that may be passing where
Sure.
white people typically do not.
Absolutely. That would be correct. And that has, because usually, and I show this, that is absolutely what happens. People look at it, and sometimes people think that this gentleman might be.
I thought it was him,
Yeah.
and I said, no, it's him.
Yeah, this is the usual person that everybody thinks is. But William White represents something that was very common, if you could pass. And so what it illustrates to us is there are probably many more that we do not know about. And so that's why I like to say, yeah, that we just don't know about historically, that they are not identified that way. And so I say Walker, his brother, William White, are among the first, because it gives credit to those that we simply have not acknowledged and should, right? And so the discovery of William White, reason you probably haven't heard, was just a few years ago. Peter Morris, a baseball historian, was the one who tracked down this whole story and found his birth records and all kinds of things and discovered that yes, but he only got a chance to play in one game, which means highly likely that somebody at that time knew, and that's why he only played in one game. Because that was typical. We've got stories of players who constantly moved because the teams, as soon as they found out or they needed them, and they were willing to take them for one game to win something, and then they wanted them gone. And so not unusual that happened, right? And so they are the predecessors, certainly, among many, to Jackie Robinson. There's a book that was written right after the turn of the century called The Colored History of Baseball, written by Saul White. And he in there talks about over 70 teams of African American gentlemen playing prior to 1900, which means there were hundreds of players that have not been acknowledged, don't get any credit to setting the opportunities for those that came later. So these are good examples of that. And they gave opportunities to individuals like this. This, of course, is Satchel Page. Buck O'Neill, and Larry Doby, the Cleveland Indians. So two who got a chance to play in the majors and one who did not. And so fairly typical idea there. This year, of course, is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Negro Leagues in 1920. February 13th, just 2 days ago, was the first meeting that set up that league that allowed Rube Foster and others to prepare the way for Jackie and Satchel. And Satchel had a long career in the Negro Leagues before he went on to play for the Indians. And it always is amazing to me that when he got to play for the Indians, he was 42 and he was named Rookie of the Year, which tells you that's amazing on one level, right? But the sad part of that is that meant they didn't recognize anything he had done and anything he had played before he joined the Indians at 42, at the age of 42. And so, and that was not atypical. And so hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of players got their chance to play in the Negro Leagues. But when Robinson integrated, right, it meant the end of the Negro Leagues. So on one side, a very positive thing, but the Negro Leagues in 1945 were estimated to be the second largest African-American business in the country, behind only insurance companies. And of course, by 1960, they're all completely gone. And since opportunities just didn't suddenly come for everybody, all of those players and all of those ticket takers and all of those owners suddenly had nothing. And that was, unfortunately, not atypical. A number of the players did find some opportunities in Canada, and so the Canadian leagues in the late 40s and 50s became the place where a lot of them went. But that's, unfortunately, the part we don't sometimes think about. When you open the door for one here, one there, what happens to all of the, and it was a huge industry and a huge business. So baseball is an interesting story, and I could talk forever about that, but I'm going to talk about a few others as well. Track and field certainly has a long history, but our earliest real forays of the track and field in any significant sense come with the establishment of the Olympics, or the more modern Olympics, which started again in 1896. This is our Olympic team from 1904, the St. Louis Olympics, and one of the gentlemen here is George Poge, and he won a bronze medal to become the first African American to do so in the 440 hurdles. Poge was from St. Louis. Family moved to Wisconsin when he was young. He actually attended the University of Wisconsin, which is how he is able to then be put on an Olympic team. And that was true of most Olympic athletes at the time. They tended to be, that's how they were found, that's how they were, because again, remember, the Olympics are not supposed to be, well, they weren't supposed to be professional, right? And so Poge got his chance in 1904, starting a long tradition here. This one picture is of John Baxter Taylor in 1908, first African American to win a gold medal as part of the 1600 meter relay team. So it's not an individual medal. That will come a little bit later. And this is in London, of course. And so you can see a gentleman from Yale there next to him as the 1600 meter relay team won. And it's interesting to read some of their accounts of their and Taylor in particular talked about something else that was very important. The recognition that participating in these sporting activities gave them opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Opportunities to travel. I mean, think about Milano in 1800, he's in England and Ireland, he's getting to go to London. Without these kinds of opportunities, they wouldn't have had these chances to get out and see, and that's how many of them then go on to have both educational and much larger careers. You look like you have a question.
I wanted to ask you this earlier.
Sure.
With Milano, was he originally French? Did he have a French background because it sounded?
No, he did not. His master did. And so that's where the name, because as often happened, they were, right? And so that's where the name came from. He was, I believe his master had a connection to Haiti. And so that explains the French influence there. And so that was the difference for him. This is to Hart Hubbard, who in 1924 was the first African American to win an individual gold medal in the long jump. Hubbard, of course, is from Cincinnati, Ohio. Also went on then to college at the University of Michigan. And so Michigan, long before some other places, that's where Walker went in the 1880s. Like Oberlin, was allowing African Americans to attend long before most other places. And so Hubbard in Cincinnati, from Cincinnati, ends up with a gold medal in the long jump in 1924. So early entrees into the Olympic world for some of our track athletes. And of course, culminates in 1936 with this gentleman here on the podium. Won 4 Olympic gold medals.
Jesse Owens.
That's Jesse Owens, right? And Jesse Owens, of course, has an Ohio connection with Cleveland, as that's where he ends up coming back to and spent the rest of his life there. Working mostly as a janitor, was completely bankrupt for much of his later life. He didn't make anything off of his, but we remember him because of the slight by Adolf Hitler, when Adolf Hitler refused to recognize him, but Hitler didn't recognize any African American or colored athletes from, as well as any of the Jewish athletes.
I believe in his autobiography, he also said that FDR did not shake his hand.
That is correct.
Right.
And that part is not usually talked about. Well, and the other part that most people don't realize is that Jesse Owens and some of the others got their chance to go to the Olympics when the United States pulled all of their Jewish athletes. And we didn't send our Jewish athletes because we were sending them to Germany. And so it's a recognition that the stories, as often, right, are much bigger than what we usually hear. But Jesse Owens certainly set a standard and showed once again to a white America and to the world that didn't want to recognize the Jackie Robinsons, the Jesse Owens of the world are not they're not unique, right? It was just simply American society and the world didn't want to give them opportunities. And so Owens certainly did not get to benefit from the success he had in Germany at that particular time. Okay? On the women's side, probably the most famous track athlete.
Wilma Rudolph.
This is Wilma Rudolph. And in 1960, she became the first African-American woman to win gold, and she won 3 gold medals at the 1960 Olympics. She came out of a heritage of female track athletes from Tennessee, the Tiger Bells. Almost all of our early female track athletes in the Olympics from the 40s, 50s, 60s all came from the same school, same coach. Bless you. And she had the most success, and did go on to have opportunity to coach, to participate in the Olympics on that side of things as a result. But of course, this is 1960, not 1936. So things certainly began to change. Thinking just on the Olympic side of things to show you something else, a little unusual. Okay, so here we are in 2002, and this is Vanetta Flowers, who won the bobsled to become the first African American to win, male or female, an Olympic medal at the Winter Olympics, and that was only 18 years ago. And of course, there you've got the issue, a variety of issues being represented, where we're talking about a question of economics as well, right? Because a lot of the Olympic sports take a great deal more resources to be able to practice, to participate, things like that. And so much harder attempts to participate. And so this surprises people when they see how late this was in 2002 for her to win. So a little bit of an Olympic trajectory there, just to show you. In the basketball world, prior to the late 1940s and 1950, basketball was a completely segregated sport. And so these are 2 of the 3 individuals who were among the first to integrate when we think about professional basketball. This is Earl Lloyd. This is Nat Clifton, and the third was Chuck Cooper. They each broke the color line in a different way in 1950. Cooper was the first to be drafted by Boston. Lloyd was the first to actually play in a game. So while Cooper was drafted, Lloyd played for the Washington Capitals in 1950, and then Nat Clifton was the first to actually sign a contract with the New York Knickerbockers. Also at the same time. There were 2 other players that were involved in that early integration. Prior to that point in time, basketball was a completely segregated, and probably the most famous basketball team of the first half of the 20th century, I would argue, was the New York Renaissance 5. They're the only full basketball team that was elected into the Basketball Hall of Fame as a team, playing from the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance all the way through the 40s, and they had some amazing players on that team. And so you can look them up as simply, they refer to all those teams as the Black Fives, and there were a number of teams from the late teens, 20s, 30s, who were playing all over the country. Most of them started as YMCA teams, and then they developed leagues from those teams, and went on to play one another and against other traveling teams. The other team that everybody thinks about, of course, is the Harlem Globetrotters, right? And the Harlem Globetrotters started during this early time period as well. Harlem Globetrotters, another example of an interesting dynamic in the sporting world. African-American team, Jewish owner. Abe Saperstein was the owner of both the Harlem Globetrotter basketball team and the Harlem Globetrotter baseball team. Goose Tatum played on both. He was on the basketball team, but he was also a first baseman on the baseball team as well. Library of Congress has some interesting footage of Tatum playing baseball with a gigantic glove that was as big as a person. So he did the same antics, and they played shadow ball on the baseball diamond before they actually did it on the basketball court. And so basketball comes along, of course, isn't invented until 1891, so that's why it's not reintegrated like some of the other sports are. Returning to boxing just for a moment, hopefully some of you recognize this gentleman.
Jack Johnson?
That is Jack Johnson, our first heavyweight champion for the United States when he won in 1908. He will hold the heavyweight title from 1908 to 1915. His overall record, 79-8, 46 of them by knockouts. Johnson was an amazing athlete, interesting human being at this time, represented, again, this dilemma for America, where we had this fascination, particularly with heavyweight boxing. And I say fascinating because I've never quite understood it. It's the one sport that I don't get, but that's just me. I mean, I get why we're fascinated, but we were particularly fascinated with heavyweight champions. And so here we are right around the turn of the century with a black man winning what was considered to be the most important title in boxing. And we didn't know what to do with that because it should have been a white man, right? And so then he will eventually, but he then challenged a number of the white champions who wouldn't fight him because they didn't want to lose to him. And so that became the way of saying, well, is he then really the champion if he hasn't beat up? But they wouldn't fight him, so that was... Jack Johnson is also one of the only individuals in the United States where you could honestly say a law was passed by Congress specifically because of one person, and that was the Mann Act, 2 N's. The Mann Act was passed in 1915, forced Jack Johnson out of the country because Johnson, as you will see, was married a number of times and had relationships with white women. And so that further complicated how America dealt with him. And so their answer was to pass the Mann Act, which made it illegal to transport white women across state lines. And so they went after Johnson for that offense, and he fled the country. And when he eventually came back, they took away all his titles and things like that. And Johnson, as you can see in this picture, in his own words said, I just wanted to enjoy life. I thought that's what we were here to all do. I love everybody. Why can't everybody just love me back? That was pretty much his attitude, and he didn't understand why this was such a problem, and why he would get cheered in the ring, and then as soon as he came out of it, the treatment that he received. But Johnson made a lot of money, as you can see. He also liked, and this is white America's version of it. They would say this was a problem as well because he liked to flaunt it in their faces, and how dare he do that was kind of the approach to Jack Johnson. And so it was very sad what happened to Johnson and how his career played out. Yeah.
It's rumored that when he lost his title in Cuba, he threw the fight to get back into this country.
That is believed to be true. We don't know for sure because that's a hard thing to pin down, but that is generally what is believed because we weren't going to let him back in as a champion. And so he had to be willing, and it was sort of our way of saying, you're coming back on our terms, and this is what we want you to do, and if you'll do it, and he wanted to come back. This was his home. And so he eventually did. Jack Johnson's career had a huge influence then on Joe Louis, right? Because Joe Louis, also obviously sort of following the trajectory of boxing, was the complete opposite in many ways, partly deliberately and partly just his personality. He was quiet. He didn't flaunt his personality. And he was encouraged not to because of what had happened to Jack Johnson. And so Louis sort of kept behind the scenes, things like that, until obviously the 1930s when he fights Max Schmeling, the German champion, twice. Loses to him the first time, and then beats him in 1938. And of course, here we are again, America. What do? Black man winning the heavyweight title, but he beat a German. And of course, this is heading into World War II, so we decide we can celebrate this, and we did. And Louis then went on to become the poster boy for most of the advertising for the military. And he got a lot of flack for that because people said, how could you do that? You're helping a country that doesn't help you. He didn't see it that way, but he also thought that was a way he could help this country and maybe make things change. And then, of course, you jump ahead real quick to Muhammad Ali, right? And you're back to sort of more of the personality of Jack Johnson, and we see what happens to Muhammad Ali during parts of his career with his more voluble personality, shall we say. And so boxing has certainly been an interesting issue. Showed these two pictures at the start, of course. Yes?
Whereas Jack Johnson was flamboyant, Joe Louis, I don't want to use the word ignorant, but he wasn't educated. If you listen to him speak, he stuttered, and he was kind of slow outside of the ring. But everybody connected with Joe Louis became rich, and he ended up a beggar out in Las Vegas. And
Correct.
one of the gambling
And that's what
casinos.
and that's what I was saying when I said he was the much quieter. He was a very different personality. Louis, and part of the reason was, it wasn't that Louis wasn't necessarily uneducated. Louis had a stutter. That was the problem. Louis was actually, he did have an education. He stuttered, and that was the problem for
He
Louis.
also donated a purse to the Army,
Yep.
to the Navy. He was taxed for it,
Yep,
and
yep.
it's just an unfortunate story.
It is. And of course, Detroit then created the Joe Louis Arena, which is now being torn down, and there's a new one being put up. So that bit of history is being taken away as well. Louis's story is a very tragic one, but he's misunderstood. And the assumption white America made was he was uneducated but it actually wasn't, that part wasn't 100% true. He simply had a stutter, and so it contributed to. We move into the tennis world, of course, and things, Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson, first to win major titles for African Americans in the 1960s. And so, again, significantly later, because tennis was always a country club sport. And so as a country club sport, that explains, again, the issues of race and economics that were very much a part of this. Same thing is going to hold true for hockey as well, things like that. And so there are a number of people you could look to here. When we look at football, just to give you a couple of other, because there's so many people you could talk about. This is Frederick Fritz Pollard. He and Bobby Marshall were the first two African Americans to play in the Professional Football League, which is also celebrating its 100th anniversary this year in September. And they played for the Akron Pros, who won the first NFL championship in 1920. And then football will move forward, and there will be African Americans playing in the 20s. And then in the 30s, they kicked them out. And then they come back with Marion Motley in the 40s, and everybody talked about football being integrated. And I'm like, no, it was reintegrated, because there were 16 African Americans, I think it is, who played prior to the mid-1930s. And so Fritz Pollard, of course, is in the Football Hall of Fame as one of those pioneers in the game of football. Willie Thrower gets a line of importance here because he's actually the first African American quarterback in professional football. Played for Michigan State for the Spartans. In 1953, he was in 2 games for the Chicago Bears. He was not, and admittedly from his own, he never started. He wasn't a great quarterback, but he did get a chance to play, and so he becomes the first African American quarterback. Again, thinking about the importance of that position. There were many other African Americans playing others, but the quarterback was seen as the quarterback on the field, the one who managed it. Same way you didn't have pitchers, right? It was considered to be, they didn't have the smarts for it, was basically white America's view of that. And so Thrower was the first in 53. This is Duke Slater, who 1951, first to be in the College Football Hall of Fame. Played for Iowa back in the late 19 teens, from 1918 to 21, before college football was the dominant, not professional football. He did go on to play for the Cardinals in the NFL, and then went on to be a judge in Chicago. And so there's quite a few of the early football players who actually went on to have careers as judges. They had strong education, and they ended up in various communities as judges. And so Slater is certainly one of those who had that opportunity. Ernie Davis in football, first Heisman African-American to win the Heisman in 1961, coming out of Syracuse, the same school, of course, that Jim Brown also went to, though Jim Brown at Syracuse was a lacrosse player and was the best lacrosse player in the country by far. And of course went on then to have a long and storied football career as well. Okay? Hockey is kind of an interesting one, and this is somebody, unfortunately, who most people don't know much about. This is Willie ORee, first African American to play professional hockey for the Bruins. Started in 1958 and would go on to play for a number of years. But ORee, again, this is an example of the issue of economics coming into play as well, because hockey is a very expensive sport to learn, to have rink time, all of those kinds of things. So it keeps a lot of people out. And so ORee came along in the late 50s, and reading his story is interesting as he talks about people being, of course, not realizing at first, because with a helmet on, you didn't necessarily know that and people being shocked to discover that there was an African American, and then they didn't quite know what to do once they found out that he was out there playing. I thought I'd throw in, just to finish off, a couple of more lesser known sports even. This is Murtis Dightman, who in 1997 was inducted into the Rodeo Hall of Fame as the first African American to do so. Think about where I started with jockeys, and this is a connection to that. 1997, okay? 7-time qualifier for the National Finals Rodeo, first black cowboy in the National Finals. And so it's kind of interesting where we started and how long it takes to see this happen. Also, an interesting story to learn more about him. And so putting his name out there for you. In car racing, we usually hear about Wendell Scott as the first African American to participate in a national series. He won the Grand National and Winston Cup Series 1963, but he's actually not the first. Elias Bowie was in 1955, almost 10 years earlier, where he participated in a sponsored 1-mile race, and he came out the winner. But Bowie, kind of what you were saying about Joe Louis, he was very quiet. He was not somebody who, and so for a long time, he wanted Wendell Scott to be recognized because he didn't want the attention. And then later, NASCAR recognized him as the first and Wendell Scott as the second, but with different at different points in time and different races. Wendell Scott in his race actually beat Richard Petty. So if you follow car racing, it tells you he was at that level. So one of the father, Richard Petty, right? Thought I would end with this one as just sort of putting it together. And these are
Carlos Jackson and Smith. I can't. No,
Tommy Smith,
Yeah, Tommy Smith.
1964 Olympics?
1968. This is the 1968 Olympics, the famous power salute where they're sharing the gloves. And what this doesn't show is they're not wearing their shoes either. And everyone always forgets about the third gentleman who won the silver medal in it and was fully aware of what they were doing and in support of. He is from New Zealand, and so fully aware of what they were doing in '68. And so a lot of individuals, a lot of different sports I wanted to show you and show you some of the differences. There are many more you could talk about, certainly, and as we should, but we only had an hour, and I kind of went over even a little. But I am happy to take any questions that anybody has, and I will try to answer them, and if I don't know, I will tell you. Yes, sir.
Couple of things. In baseball, were you aware that individuals like Josh Gibson and Page played with Dizzy Dean?
Oh
and
yeah,
Paul
the Dizzy Dean
in
All
the
Stars,
off-
Bob Feller All Stars.
In the off season, they tour Latin America and what have you.
Oh yeah, they played in Latin America since the 19th century and all the way up into the 20th century. The two most famous all-star teams are the Dizzy Dean and the Bob Feller, but those were only two of many. Jackie Robinson actually had his own all-star team that traveled with them. That was a very common occurrence, mostly because they didn't make enough money during the year to not have to have, they needed a job, and they wanted to play baseball. And so many of the most interesting story of Latin America is Satchel Page going down there to the Dominican Republic in 1937 with a number of other players to play in a political game to help the dictator of the Dominican at that time keep his presidency. And they were basically threatened, either you win this game or you're not leaving the country.
And then in football, Paul Robeson.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, Paul
Okay.
Robeson, who went on to have, obviously,
Singing
the opera career, the singing career, football player with Jackie Robinson and others at the time. And he and Jackie Robinson later on had some falling out over their politics, because Robinson was a Republican, and Robeson was accused of being a communist because he had traveled to Russia. And so simply doing that made him a communist in the 1930s. And so that hurt Robeson's chances at a bigger career than what he had. He would have been even bigger than he was if it hadn't been for that in the 1930s. Other questions or comments or thoughts or wonderings that I can?
Comments, you did a nice job, I enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I appreciate your kind attention. Sure. I always find it important to do these because we just don't acknowledge way too much, and don't want to talk about it.
Too many revisionists in the world trying to rewrite a lot of people's histories.
Oh, absolutely. And we have to stand up and not let that happen and correct things when they are wrong, or say, I don't know and I should know, so I got to go look it up. That's part of the reason why I wanted to introduce you to as many as I could, with just a little bit, hopefully to catch your interest and say, oh, I want to go know more about them. So that's always my goal anyway. Anything else on this fine Saturday afternoon? All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and spend an afternoon with you.